Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Hello and welcome to At the Controls with Jonathan Ledyard and Mark Gallagher, the podcast that takes inspiration from Formula One, the people, the cars, the technology and the positive philosophy that underpins the sport. And they don't come much more positive than Daniel Ricciardo, the Australian Grand Prix driver, with a megawatt smile that can light up the world, especially when he's on song. But what happens when he's not? Well, Daniel's been sharing his thoughts with At the Controls about how he copes with the demands and expectations of such a high-profile world, and specifically how a break in New York kept him on track. Seems extraordinary to go to such a busy city and find yourself, but he did. Mark, you've been speaking to someone with a very different take, though, on Formula One at the moment.
Yeah, it's been an interesting experience. So I've talked to a fast jet pilot, a lady who became the second woman ever to fly a Tornado GR4 in combat for the Royal Air Force. Also talking to someone with really quite a story to tell, a Formula One fan who is a final year neurosurgery student in Beirut and who's been at the epicenter of the tragic events that have happened there in recent days.
It's an extraordinary story. You want to listen to that. And also, as motorsport talks confidently about improving diversity, I've been speaking to Carol Glenn, the first black woman to become a race official in the UK. She set up an academy to develop BAME talent across the industry. She wasn't actually at Silverstone, because none of us were at Silverstone, although she could have been there possibly as a marshal in her previous days. But in terms of the two Silverstone Formula One races, if you thought Mercedes were going to run away with the title in 2020, Mark, not so fast, probably, fair to say.
God, it was incredible, wasn't it? I mean, I think we came into both of those races thinking this will be a complete Mercedes-Benz walkover. It's the fastest car in Formula One by quite a margin, like by about a second a lap around Silverstone. Honestly, Jonathan, it looked like their cars were too fast for that circuit. They were certainly too fast for their tyres, weren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, and you think back to the first race when you thought Lewis Hamilton was lucky to finish on three wheels. You thought he was going to try and do it again in the second race. But of course, Red Bull got their strategy, and with Max Verstappen there as well, they got everything right. Fantastic team performance, really, don't you think?
Yeah, it's actually, I think, quite heartening. We were all getting slightly depressed after those first four Grand Prix, thinking, are we actually in for a complete whitewash by Mercedes-Benz? And suddenly to turn up at that second Silverstone race, and I think we really felt that after the last lap or end of race dramas in the first race of Silverstone, we thought Mercedes will certainly tighten their belt or gird their loins. They'll turn up at Silverstone for the second race and absolutely walk away with it. And the opposite happened. It was hotter, the tyres were softer, and all of a sudden Red Bull had the ace card. They have a car which maybe doesn't produce quite the same amount of downforce as a Mercedes-Benz. We certainly know it doesn't have anything like the engine power, particularly in qualifying. Somehow a lot easier on its tyres, and they were able to just run a beautiful race with Max Verstappen in total control. And it was not only great to see, it was great to hear, Jonathan, because I think at one point early in the race, his engineer was telling him, you need to slow down, the tyres are overheating. Max was in total control. He wasn't having any of it. He was going after Mercedes, and he beat them fair and square.
Just stay hydrated and sanitize yourself, I think, was the great exchange over the 2 weekends between Max Verstappen and his race engineer. So, Mark, to your fast jet pilot, someone who enjoys flying at 500 miles an hour, barely 100 feet off the ground. Tell us more.
Absolutely. Well, if you remember, Jonathan, a couple of episodes back, we had a great chat with former Red Arrows pilot Ben Murphy. But I then came across a book by Mandy Hickson. It's a new book. Now, Mandy is a former RAF fast jet pilot herself, only the second woman ever to have flown Tornado GR4s operationally, and she jumped at the chance of joining us on At the Controls. And I started by asking her about the title of her book, An Officer, Not a Gentleman.
Basically, it was just one of the chapters in my book. And as I was reading it, I was going for lots of different thoughts. I personally wanted big bird's eye view, which was basically my call sign used to be Big Bird. And so I thought that was quite relevant. But I was sort of informed that wasn't probably that politically correct. So we looked at different ones. And actually, An Officer, Not a Gentleman just kept on coming back to the front of my mind. And I just think it was so good to have a little bit of a play on the lovely film with Richard Gere. And, it sort of sums up my life, really. Very much an officer, very much a pilot, fast jet pilot, but certainly not a gentleman.
Now, let's start right at the beginning. You became interested in flying, I believe, as a result of your maternal grandfather. Just talk to us a little bit about him and the impression that he made on your life.
Well, he was an incredible man, actually. And we used to visit him in all the school holidays, and he would drip feed me these stories of, incredible trips that he flew as he was flying the Harvard and the Oxford. And he was an instructor down in South Africa, training all the pilots as well to qualify. And you don't realize it at the time, but they are having a huge influence on you. So as I was growing up, I started to think about aviation more and more and think about flying as a potential job. But it was very much an all-male dominated environment of which women weren't allowed to be pilots in the Air Force at that time. So that door was sort of shut, but certainly as flying went, it was definitely there.
Now, your grandfather flew Harvards and Oxfords, and this was during the Second World War, is that correct?
Yeah, it was. It was all throughout that period, basically. Throughout my time in the Air Force, he actually, saw my progress and was incredibly proud of everything I achieved. And then sadly, he passed away actually just before I qualified and went to fly Tornadoes. It was the days before mobile phones, and my grandpa was really reaching the very last days of his life and was very, very poorly. And my mum managed to track me down through lots of different phone calls. And I had a big, a tannoy that went out in the airport. Could you, Flight Lieutenant Wells, please come to the desk? And I went to the desk and they said, I'm sorry to say, you could really do with getting up to Yorkshire. Well, I was over in Norwich and we instantly looked at trains and it was going to be a 4-hour train journey, lots of changes. And I turned to my instructor and went, I'm not sure what to do. And he said, but Mandy, in a Hawk, it'll take us 10 minutes. It's straight across the Wash. And so we whipped a plan together. We contacted Humberside Airport. I said to my mum, could you pick me up at the airport? She said, certainly. And we nipped into this Hawk. We took off. We landed 20 minutes later or whatever it was, with my mum very proudly going, that's my daughter. I swanned in through the arrivals, lounge in all my flying kit. And we got to my grandfather and he passed away that evening. And I just think it was a really big move, actually. It was a good call from my instructor at the time. If he'd taken that all the way to the top, it would have taken hours to come through, but he made a decision. And so often we see that middle managers don't make those decisions, and he was happy to be held accountable for it. And what he bought with me was something that money could never buy. He bought an amazing loyalty to the service. And it really emphasized the point that once you join the military and an organization like the RAF, it is a family and they do look after you.
Now, let's talk about what's involved in becoming a fast jet pilot and some of the challenges that surely presented themselves to you as a woman wanting to follow that route. But let's maybe start with the practicalities. How on earth do you become a fast jet pilot?
Well, through a lot of training, basically. When I first applied to join, I failed all the tests to be a pilot, firstly, which wasn't particularly impressive. I then took them for the second and final time and I failed them again. But I'd had about 160 hours of flying under my belt by this stage. And, I basically had incredible support from a gentleman who was the boss of my university air squadron, another club run by the RAF. And he put his neck on the line and he basically wanted to challenge the system and said, hold on a minute, the RAF has only just opened its doors to girls. Mandy has failed all the tests, yet she has proved herself to be a really capable pilot. And he wanted to challenge that to say maybe the tests are designed for men and not for women. And basically, through his perseverance, I managed to get a branch change to become a pilot. And that's when you start a very lengthy 4.5-year training it was for myself to get to the front line. And you start by flying something quite, easy, propeller aeroplane, traveling at 120 miles an hour. And then each stage, you basically double the speed. You then go to Tucanos, and it's now going at 240 miles an hour. And then you end up on Hawks, and they're traveling at 420 miles an hour. And suddenly that's where you get the rush. That's where you get that thrill and the speed. And you're in a jet. And RAF Valley is a really intense flying training period. It's just under a year long. And it's like doing an advanced driving test twice a day for an entire year. That's stressful.
Now, I've never flown in a fast jet. I've been driving through the Highlands of Scotland or somewhere and seen low-level flying, seen a jet come over a hill or up a valley. How demanding is that kind of training? At some point you have to do that for the first time. Pretty hair-raising stuff, I would have thought.
It is, but again, they are brilliant in how they structure your training. So I guess very much similar to Formula One. You're not just going to get into a Formula One car. You've stepped it up and stepped it up until you're capable of handling that machine. And that is exactly the same as flying. You step it down. So you would start by flying at 500 feet, and then in increments, you would drop down to eventually the 250 feet. And then once you get to the front line, so flying the Tornadoes, you will actually practice something called operational low flying, and that's at 100 feet. Now, if you think of an electrical pylon as 250 feet, you're not even halfway up one of those, traveling at 500 miles an hour. And that is literally completely consuming. You can barely look to the sides. You are looking in front, and you are almost, mirroring the terrain in front of you. That is phenomenal.
Now, tell me this: when you're flying at 100 feet, what kind of speed are you doing?
So you're traveling at 500 knots, which is probably, someone will correct me on this one, but you can add a few increments. So probably about 550 miles an hour. And yeah, the world is whipping past you at that stage. But much like as if you're traveling in a train, if you're looking to the side, of course it feels like it's going very quickly, but you're looking in front. And that's where, as pilots, we're really trained to keep this situational awareness about you, to constantly improve your scan rate so that you're keeping a bigger picture. You can see what's happening, and you can actually adapt to the things that happen pretty quickly.
Now, did simulators play much of a role in your training?
Yeah, absolutely. So before you get airborne in a Tornado, and in fact a Hawk, you will have done hours and hours in a simulator. And the simulators are incredible pieces of equipment these days that, you really do almost feel like you're flying. You're strapping in, you're going through all the procedures, you're taxiing the aircraft out, taking off. And so when you actually get into the jet for the first time, everything feels familiar. You're not sitting in an unusual environment. It feels like you're, in your office space, let's say, and you're just going to be doing it for real. But your hand movements by that stage are automatic, because that's a really huge part to play, is the automatic processing, and that actually you want to be going through, motor programs that you're not having to think about, so that you can free up your capacity for making better decisions.
Now, when I was reading the background to your book and preparing for this conversation we're having today, Mandy, I was completely dumbfounded to read some of the sexism that you face. I was dumbfounded because I still can't get my head around the fact that there are chaps who will say things of the kind that were said to you. Just talk to us a little bit about the sexism that you did face and how you overcame that.
Well, it's interesting. I think you basically get a very thick skin. And, I am a really robust character. Anyone that knows me sort of would probably agree with that wholeheartedly. And you stop noticing it. But one of the most poignant parts for myself was I was going through fast jet training at Valley, and I had my wonderful course mates around me. And basically, they were the ones that noticed that every single day, at least once a day, each instructor would make just a small comment to me, not meant actually, in a harmful way, but it would just be a derogatory comment. We can tell which jet Mandy's parked in. It's the one that's not straight. Oh, before Mandy gets out, she'll be taking some time to apply her makeup. If I responded, it would be something about the time of the month. And if every single one of the 20 instructors makes one comment, that's 20 sexist comments a day. And I was just oblivious. I was just, yes, yeah, very funny. But it was my course mates that didn't like it. And they went to the boss on my behalf and said, we don't like this. Please can you have a word with your instructors and actually stop them from making these comments to Mandy? And I just thought that was probably, if you want to know what teamwork's about, that is it, isn't it? It's when people realise what you're going through when you don't even realise it, and they do something about it to change it for the better. So yeah, that was a wonderful moment for me.
Now, in the world of motor racing, one of the glaring omissions in Formula One is that we don't have a female Formula One driver, and we haven't had one for a very, very, very long time. Last year, a championship was created, W Series, which we spoke about just before we came on air. What's your view on a sport like Formula One actually creating what some people would call a segregated category for women to try and fill the pipeline with talent. Do you think that's a worthy approach, or what's your opinion?
Yes, I think it's a really interesting one, isn't it? So you will have on one side of the argument people saying, well, if women want to compete in an equal playing field, then they should be up against the men. But obviously, if that hasn't been working, because it has never worked until this point, then we've got to do something differently. And so I think it's actually quite forward thinking for the Formula One to actually start thinking, how can we go about changing this? And sometimes we do need to push changes through. Women and men don't compete against each other at Wimbledon. You don't have a women's team against a men's team on the cricket pitch. So actually, for Formula One, yeah, we do want an open playing field, but at the same time, how are you going to get it? And it's the same in business. If we don't start to actually push women up through, then you're never going to get someone that actually can be the CEO if we haven't got that pipeline filled. And so actually, sometimes you have to do something really proactive to make change.
Now, let's cut to the nitty-gritty of what you ended up doing. You're then flying Tornado GR4s. You did, 3 tours of duty?
Yeah, that's right, over Iraq.
Over Iraq. Just share some of your memories and reflections on that time.
Yeah, so it was the build-up to Gulf War II, and we were defending the no-fly zone over southern Iraq. So we were based out of Ali al-Salem, just outside Kuwait. And yeah, basically we would be airborne most days on reconnaissance trips or a show of force, or we were there basically to say, we are present, please do not build up your troops and, your weapons and things. So, we were ever present, but we were very much getting engaged, not necessarily on a daily basis. When I say engaged I'm talking about engaged by the enemy as attacks. So I had been shot at by surface-to-air missiles where one locked onto the heat of my engines. I managed to evade the threat by putting out my flares. The missile locked onto my flares, which then exploded about 2 miles from the jet. So that was one hairy night. And I was part of a formation, and we were immediately then tasked to carry out a bombing mission on a target that had been pre-designated, that if an aggressive act was made towards any one of our coalition aircraft, that we would prosecute and attack. So I happened to be leading that night, the 4-ship, and I was probably the most junior on my team. And yet you still continue to lead. It's a really lovely lesson for businesses that so often tasks are given to other people. And when the going gets tough, the boss will leap in and take control. But that doesn't happen in the military. If a junior pilot is leading, they continue to lead. And therefore you get this growth in leadership and decision-making, the accountability, all of those really good things that we talk about all the time. They are so relevant. But that night stands up as one of my most memorable events, which is why actually it's on the back of the book. We called it Break Right, which is what my navigator shouted at me when he saw that we'd been engaged by a missile.
He shouted at you probably with a great sense of urgency.
Yes, you could say that there was a slightly elevated pitch to his tone, yes.
Tell me this, we never get to really talk to people who have done what you've done. What's the experience like to fly a Tornado GR4 in the heat of battle, or just on training over the Scottish Highlands?
Yeah, I'm going to focus actually on that low level environment, because that is my favourite environment. So if you can imagine you're flying along, you drop down from height and you start to go incrementally down, and suddenly you're flying really close to the ground. You have a bubble around the aircraft, but as you're going down valleys, these valleys are whipping past so fast. You're looking ahead, and then you'll see somebody on a hill, perhaps walking in the Scottish Highlands, and you think, this is fascinating. A, I am below them. B, they cannot hear or see me yet. And you sort of creep up behind them, and just as you go past, you have that wonderful ability to turn the jet on its side and give them a wave out the top of the canopy. And that is the most incredible rush. You can just see them, A, jumping in surprise, and then sort of saluting or waving back. And they almost can't believe that you can see them. And, what you're doing there when you're trained, I mean, the actual adrenaline rush is phenomenal. I prefer the low-level environment to air combat, for example. Everyone always thinks that people are going to love air combat, which is that gladiatorial nature of one jet versus another, or maybe 2 or 3 aircraft. And I did enjoy that, but the low level and the precision that is needed for weapons attacks on time, on target, delivered, with absolute precision. I loved that attention to detail that you had to have for that environment. And that adrenaline rush of low flying, there is nothing that beats it in the world.
Mandy's book, An Officer Not a Gentleman, is available on Amazon and is selling like the proverbial hotcakes and getting great reviews into the bargain. Now, to the publisher who turned her down on the basis that men wouldn't necessarily want to read about a woman flying jets, can you believe that? That was clearly a bad day at the office. It's an absolute page turner.
And she's breaking down barriers. I mean, talking all about the challenges to realise your dream. And I love the bit particularly when she talked about the junior pilot being allowed to stay as the lead. That surely, as she highlighted, that's a great lesson in business. It's the same in sport, surely. If you're good enough, you're old enough. Look at Max Verstappen, or look at, before that, say, someone like Kimi Räikkönen.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that someone like Toto Wolff really believes in. If you employ someone in a Formula One team, let them crack on with the job, give them full responsibility for the area that they're working in. And I think that really does encourage people. It develops them massively in her career. And just one other thing about Mandy, she was at pains when I spoke to her to say, look, I am actually long past breaking the glass ceiling in the Air Force. To her, all the issues she came up against were 25 years ago. And she really impressed upon me that today it's an absolutely equal opportunities employer, great opportunity for young women and girls to consider going into the RAF, whether as a pilot or in another role. And it was just fantastic. And she is such a good ambassador, not just for the Royal Air Force, but I think for any women wanting to achieve something that previously might have seemed out of reach, but absolutely is now a level playing field.
We'll pick up with that with Carol Glenn, who's the first black woman to become a race official in the UK. She'll be talking to us later in At the Controls with Jonathan Ledyard and Mark Gallagher. Now, we always hear this, sing when you're winning. It's a popular cry, and it's easy to be happy, we know, when things are going well in your life. But what happens when you're struggling? You're not getting the results, you're not getting the breaks. Mental health is understood much more as a vital element of any team success, any player success, which is why the Renault Formula One team asked Daniel Ricciardo to talk to staff about how he has his coping strategies and how he uses them. And that's how we began our chat, Daniel and I, how we cope with all the attention, especially in a sport where risk and danger are ever present.
I think we're used to it in terms of there probably is a greater pressure, but it's kind of all we've ever known. I played some other sports as a kid, but never to this level, not even close. So I guess that's always there, and you become accustomed to it. But once also you've been doing it for so long, you're aware of the risks and I guess the pressure that comes with that. But you put it to the back of your mind, and you're just tunnel vision, and you're also quite aware that any of these thoughts are potentially going to slow you down. So yeah, it's on the back burner, I guess.
It's a gladiatorial sport, isn't it? It can be seen as macho, it's testosterone fueled. How easy is it to let people know if you're struggling, having a tough time for whatever reason?
Yeah, it's I think you use the word macho, and I guess I thought of it's probably a bit harder for men to break through with that, because there's that perception of, oh yeah, I'm big and strong, and I'm the provider and all this sort of stuff. A lot of old school ways of thinking. But the thing which helps me is having close people around me and friends and people that I can talk to and trust and know that if I do get emotional or something, that they're not going to call me weak or anything. They're going to put their arm around me and understand where I'm coming from. So I think that's the biggest thing. I think everyone has the ability to open up. I think at times everyone wants to open up, but it's that uncertainty of who to open up to. So it's just really finding someone you can really lean on. And even if that person you're not sure of, I'm sure 9 times out of 10 they might surprise you, and I'm sure they'll be open ears and open arms.
Could you tell anything to a teammate? Because, as you know, in Formula One, that's the benchmark, and any weakness can easily be exploited by a teammate, and you could turn that around. And if someone told you that they were struggling, you go, aye, I'll have you on the track.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think you have to be probably a little bit more selective with what you say to a direct competitor. But, on the flip side, I think if you have enough confidence in yourself, a lot of the time you can be happy to put everything on the table, and deep down you're like, okay, well, I'm no longer vulnerable. I've put everything out there, so at least my plate is clear, and now I can just focus on the job. So it can probably work both ways, really.
You can go from hero to zero very fast in Formula One, not least on social media. I mean, I'm wondering what your techniques are for handling the stress, the scrutiny, the pressure, the demands.
I think it's one thing I've always found helps is having other interests, and I think if my life was only Formula One, I think that would consume me, and the pressures of the sport and not having a good race would probably eat me up inside for too long. If I have a bad race or a moment where I'm unhappy with my performance or what's going on in the sport, yeah, it might consume me for the Sunday evening, but by Monday, I don't know, trying to put my thoughts somewhere else and go out go play some sports or go see some music, or I think just have an escape. And I think that's important for everyone, whatever your job is, it's to have an interest outside of it that you can go and attend and clear your head a little bit.
Is there a moment which you could share, say, from your career when things looked or felt bleak, and then what you learnt from that particular episode?
Yeah, there was a highlight for me was back in 2013. It was still relatively early in my F1 career, and I was very strict on myself, like very hard on myself. I was very disciplined with everything, the way I eat and not allowing myself really to have a beer or to go and party. And for a 23, 24-year-old kid, it wasn't really normal. And so I was in my head, I was doing everything right, and the results, for a few weeks, the results weren't there, and I was kind of banging my head against the wall, wondering what else I could do. So I just got away for a bit. I was like, maybe I'm just putting too much into this, and I'm going down a rabbit hole of trying to look into too many details, where it's like I need to just step away for a bit. So it was the Montreal race, and Montreal is close to New York, and I'd never been to New York. So I was like, I'm just going to go to New York for a few days. And I had some friends with me. So I was like, let's just go and basically just not think or talk about racing, and just go to a new city where F1 doesn't exist, and have a few drinks and just go out and just kind of just take a break. And that was really the best thing I did. It really eased me in a lot of ways. And also it kind of made me appreciate the sport, like missing it and, not thinking about it every day. I was then happy to go back into it after that holiday.
That's really interesting, because I was going to ask you about the lifestyle, because Formula One is seen as this very glamorous profession, but you're on the road, you're living out of hotels, you're away from family, etc., etc. How do you cope with that? I mean, you did that from early age as well, didn't you? You came to Europe, and I mean, that's a big step. So how have you managed to shape your mind and keep yourself on the straight and narrow when sometimes it's just a hotel room and you?
That's one of the hardest things, and I think that's what actually can break a lot of kids, when they move home. And it's really having that long-term vision, and the first years of me living away from home. Yeah, I missed home, and at that point I wasn't earning any money, or I wasn't guaranteed to make it in F1 or anything. But I was like, okay, yes, this isn't particularly perfect right now, but this is what everyone went through. This is what Schumacher went through. This is what all the good guys did, and this is what I have to do to get there if I want to get there. So I just saw it as that, this is a little sacrifice, but ultimately, if this means I can race F1 and get paid to do the job I love, then this is nothing. So it was really just that, and it's all perspective and mindset, and it's understanding that sometimes there is a bit of a slow grind, but if it's going to get you a step closer to what you want, then I think anything's worth it.
It's clearly working, because this is your 10th season in Formula One, so you know what you're doing. But I wonder how much you developed as a person as much as a driver, someone who knows the ups and downs. You've talked about Montreal, also someone who's prepared to stand up for what he believes in. I look at Lewis Hamilton, for example, who seems to have grown into this statesman about Black Lives Matter. But in terms of you and your development and what matters to you, would you stay quiet and just stick to racing, or are you quite happy to go, no, I need to speak up here?
Yeah, that comes with, I think, with age, through, I guess, confidence. It's even here in Formula One, with like the drivers' meetings. When I first got to F1, I was quite shy and nervous and didn't feel like I yet really belonged in that room, so to speak. So I would be less vocal, less opinionative on some things, and now, because I feel I've kind of paid my dues in this sport, and if I just feel like, I have a bit more of a right to really speak my mind, whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but that was kind of what I went through in my head. And you evolve as a person, you find things that work for you, things that don't, and you learn from other people as well, the path they've gone on and where that didn't work for them. So, and you meet some amazing people, and you can just be a sponge, especially at a young age, on an international sport with, people from all around the world. So I think as well, there's, whether it's, like mental health or, Black Lives Matter, a lot of this stuff is new for so many people. And again, it's just allowing yourself to be a little bit vulnerable. And if you really feel strongly about something, then speak up. And I think normally you'll find it can go a long way. And we have that platform as well to do so.
He seems so level-headed, don't you think, Mark? And he just is able to ride the storms, the whirlpools in Formula One, but also ride the rapids too. And when he gets things and gets a car and gets that ability to show his talent, he's one of the best out there, one of the best overtakers there is, even though Alexander Albon is now challenging his crown maybe. But he's able to take the slings and arrows very calmly. And I was fascinated to hear that about that trip to New York when he was early in his Formula One career, just when he had to clear his brain. He was thinking, maybe almost overthinking, that everything he was doing should be contributing to success in Formula One, but it wasn't. And it just happened to be that take that plug out, sort of unplug for a while, regroup, rethink with friends, and suddenly things start to flow.
Yeah, that was really interesting, because we think of Daniel Ricciardo as not just a great racing driver, but something of a joker. He's always having a good laugh, and he looks like a very jolly individual. So to hear him talking about maybe some of the darker sides of being an elite sports person, very interesting. My big takeaway from listening to Daniel talking to you, Jonathan, is that when we think about some of the criticisms that Lewis Hamilton gets for the fact that he's got so many interests outside of Formula One, what effectively Daniel Ricciardo is saying is that that's a really good thing for your mental approach to the sport, because it's by taking time away and actually doing something completely different that when you get back into the cockpit, back into the hot seat with the team, suddenly you're refreshed and you're able to crack on. So really interesting to hear that in their very different ways, Daniel and Lewis are essentially doing the same thing and really benefiting from it.
Now, the Renault Formula One team are going to have a driver called Fernando Alonso driving for them next season. Daniel Ricciardo, as you know, is going off to McLaren. Have you been talking to a big fan of Fernando Alonso, Mark? But the last week has been one of the most challenging in his life, surely, because he lives in Beirut in Lebanon.
Yeah, it was extraordinary getting the opportunity to talk to Fred Bteich, and I actually met him through Twitter. So, the glories of social media, it's all not all negative. There's some really good upsides. None of us are ever going to quite forget the images which came out of Beirut on the 4th of August, when a warehouse fire in the port area ignited 2,750 tons, an extraordinary amount, of ammonium nitrate, which had been stored in an adjacent building for the past 6 years. Now, this is the stuff which can be used as a fertilizer, but unfortunately, as those of us from Northern Ireland know only too well, it can also be the key ingredient in making a lethal bomb. The resulting explosion looked for all the world like a mini nuclear bomb. It killed over 150 people, injured 6,000, extraordinary numbers, and it laid waste to a large part of this historic city. Now, Formula One being a global community, as I said, I reached out on Twitter to a diehard fan who happens to live in the city, but has been at the center of the emergency response. Fred is 29 years of age. He's a final year neurosurgery resident at the Hôtel Dieu de France University Hospital, and he's been operating on the victims with serious facial, head and brain injuries in the days since. So, Jonathan, while we have all been enjoying back-to-back Grand Prix at Silverstone, Fred, our fellow fan, has had a week that he would much rather forget. And I started by asking him how he became a fan of our sport.
I remember watching my first F1 Grand Prix back when I was 12 years old. This is like 17 years ago. I started becoming a fan. I just liked the sound of cars. I just liked racing, and I developed this passion. I became a diehard fan quite rapidly. Even waking up in the middle of the night, let's say, for example, when the Grand Prix took place in Melbourne, Australia, Mom was like, "What are you doing in the middle of the night?" And no, there's a Formula One Grand Prix. No way to miss this one.
I understand you're a fan of Fernando Alonso's. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm a fan of Fernando Alonso. I'm a big fan of Fernando Alonso. I mean, this guy really grabbed my attention with his explosive starts, with his. Let's not talk about his personality, a bit, let's say, moody, but I guess he's a brilliant driver. To me, he's maybe the biggest driver the F1 scene has seen in the last decade or so, Senna aside.
I have to make an admission to you, which is that Fernando has blocked me on Twitter.
Oh.
Yeah, he blocked me on Twitter because on the BBC I criticised him for being quite rude about Honda when Honda were supplying engines to McLaren, and I think his manager didn't like what I said.
As a driver, I think if we can give him the same car we can give to Hamilton, to Bottas, or Verstappen, even if we put them all in the same car with the same specs, I think he would easily beat them all.
Now, that we don't, of course, have a Formula One race in Lebanon, but you have actually managed to get down to see one of the Red Bull demonstration runs a few years ago, and I think that was with Carlos Sainz, isn't that correct?
Absolutely, that was with Carlos Sainz. And it was a very nice experience. You know, a few people know that back in 1999, there was a plan to host a Beirut Grand Prix in the middle of downtown Beirut. So it would have been a Monaco thing, a Monaco circuit-like. And this is where the demonstration happened. The Red Bull thing was really nice. There's a big community of F1 fans in here who would love to have a Grand Prix here.
Now, let's just talk about what happened, because just tell us about what happened on Tuesday evening in Beirut and your personal experience of that.
Yeah, well, Tuesday evening was a sad day in the history of Beirut and Lebanon. I was home, just a couple of meters away from my hospital. The hospital I work at. I'm a neurosurgery fellow there. So I was resting home in front of my laptop, and all of a sudden, everything around me started moving. I thought at first that it was an earthquake happening, and I couldn't even have time to think what to do next. I just grabbed my stuff, and while things were still moving around me, I live on the ground floor, so I thought, oh God, now the whole building will collapse on me. So I was going towards the door, and this is when the explosion happened. The blast was loud. Anyone who heard it thought it happened right next to them, and then there was silence. I don't think even talking or seeing pictures or videos about what happened can give it justice, because you had to be there to really know how severe things were, how traumatizing things were. I just went straight to the OR, to the operation room. I skipped the ER, the emergency department that was filled with patients, and they were piled up around on beds, on the floor, outside. It was just a nightmare. As soon as I entered the OR, it was like a war zone. It was apocalyptic scenes. It's like you're in a horror movie, and you want to wake up from this nightmare. We tried to do some sort of triage, and to see what case was urgent, what case could wait a bit, but we had to, of course, take care of the ones who were vital first, then the others. And when it comes to my field of work in neurosurgery, of course, we had many patients, many injuries related to the face and to the brain itself. Sadly enough, they tackled mostly young people, and we operated on some when we even knew the prognosis was very dark and we wouldn't be able to save them. But just for the sake of doing so, the heart was beating, so we had to do what we had to do. And after that, we'll leave it to the natural evolution of things, because we've operated on a child who was 3 years old. Yeah, it was sad. It was very sad, traumatic at the same time, if I may say. And we kept on pushing. We started working around 6:30 p.m. just right after the explosion happened, and I couldn't look at my phone, and I was moving from chamber to from room from an operation room to another, from patient to patient, up until 3:34 a.m. nonstop. Then could barely sleep that night. Then the second day, the cycle repeated, and so on and so forth. So we've been really suffering physically and mentally. We're devastated, but we're trying to find some support among each other. Plagued with insomnia, lack of food, but the adrenaline keeps us going forward. And just like in Formula One, you want to cross the finish line and manage to save as many people as possible.
Inevitably, the news headlines around the world, certainly here in Europe, the news headlines will start to disappear about Beirut probably after a week or 10 days. How long do you think this is going to affect your city? This is what do you think the impact will be long term on Beirut and on the Lebanon?
This is very tough to answer, but at the same time, it's going to be a sad answer, because I think Beirut, although it will rebuild itself and it will take some time to rebuild itself, I don't know how much people are going to be able to rebuild themselves mentally and psychologically, because this is the most important part. The lives we lost, the homes we lost, the Beirut we lost, everything. Some people have nothing but ruins left. Nothing. No family members, no house to shelter them. It's gonna take a long while, a very long while to recover from this. I couldn't even imagine, in fact, that one day at 29 I would live to experience such a thing.
Now, as you know, Formula One is a global sport. It's followed by many tens, indeed hundreds of millions of people around the world, and everyone's been shocked by what they've seen on TV. What would your message be to the Formula One community about the way in which they might be able to assist you and the people in Beirut if they want to provide more than just social media support with messages?
Yeah, I've checked some of the accounts of drivers and F1 staff and responsible people, and I've seen some emotional posts and posts of support from Perez, Leclerc, Jean Todt, Hamilton, Gasly, to name a few. These were moving, these were very nice, but I think this is not enough. We know that Formula One, just like tennis, are wealthy communities, and people there could help pretty much, especially financially. Just like Formula One this year adopted this message, we race as one. I hope that we could use something of the sort for Beirut, and we say we will build it as one as well.
I'm always amazed talking to people who've been through extraordinary experiences, life-changing, potentially life-shattering experiences, how calm and detached they sound. I mean, he is a surgeon. So as we know from our experience talking to Martin Elliott earlier in the series about how surgeons at Great Ormond Street Hospital learnt from Formula One, how clinical they can be, how detached they have to be, because it is a very emotional and very challenging environment in which they work, and you have to be absolutely removed, as you might say, from what you're dealing with. But the way he was able to separate his love of Formula One, his passion for Fernando Alonso and Renault, and then exactly what he had to go through is extraordinary. And I also was struck by how he wanted Formula One to put actions behind their words of support on Twitter, because so many people can do lots of things on Twitter by just saying things about, I really feel for people, RIP and so on. But actually it's doing something which really counts, don't you think?
Yeah, it was very much the case that he was appreciative of the fact that so many people in Formula One had put messages on social media about the Beirut explosion. And it's something that I haven't ever really thought about before, because we see all of these worthy comments and we kind of gloss over them. And Fred was really at pains to point out to me during our whole conversation that when, as a Formula One fan in Beirut, when you come online and you see that Sergio Perez has sent a message to everyone in Beirut, and Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton and Jean Todt, he said it actually really meant something to him. It felt it connected him with a community that he's passionate about, and it was nice to see them passionate back. And I mean, he really struck me as a guy who was at pains to say, look, if you have the ability to help us in some way, clearly financially, there are lots of ways in which you can do it. But he wasn't saying that that's the only thing. He was saying that really any support that you can give, even as just moral support, is going to be beneficial. But there's no question about it that financial contributions to the Lebanese Red Cross, which is a completely independent organization, is a great way to get funding straight to the people who need it most. And I think, again, a legacy, I think, for me of that interview with Fred is that in the coming months and probably years, I'm going to keep in touch with what's happening in Beirut. And I am really never going to quite forget the fact that he said they will rebuild the city, but he doubts very much that they will rebuild the people who have lived through it, himself included. And I think his comment about the fact that as a 29-year-old, he never expected to experience what he's now been confronted with. It's going to leave a legacy of mental health and all kinds of things, which shall be there for a long time to come.
Let's pick up on Fred's point also about Formula One's new slogan, #WeRaceAsOne, because the pre-race rituals, certainly at Silverstone, were much better choreographed. But are they just words? Are they just shows? Is there action being taken? Well, one Formula One fan is determined to drive progress at the grassroots in the United Kingdom. Her name is Carol Glenn. She was the first black woman to become a race official, but it was a rocky road to achieve her ambition. So she's founded an academy to try to smooth the path for fellow BAME race fans to follow her lead. And she's been talking to me about her passion for cars and motorsport.
My heroes was James Hunt. I remember watching James Hunt on TV when I was about 11 or 12. And I was absolutely fascinated by the British Grand Prix, or any of the Grand Prix. And then as I got involved in motorsport, Derek Bell became my hero in Le Mans. And I've been fortunate enough to have gone to Le Mans and marshalled at Le Mans, and watching those cars up close and personal is absolutely awesome.
Wow. So I'd imagine Le Mans, in terms of being a marshal in motorsport, Le Mans must have been, right up there with the highlights. Any others that sort of stand out? Any big meetings? British Grand Prix? Did you ever do that?
I did. My first British Grand Prix, I went as a spectator in 1989, and I marshalled it in, I think, 90 or 91. But the other meeting I remember going to and marshalling as was Nürburgring World Touring Cars. That was awesome as well.
And what about your reception and how you found working there as a black woman? I mean, that's quite a challenge, surely.
Well, you get used to people looking at you, sometimes doing a double take. I have a double whammy. I mean, not only am a black girl, I'm also a woman. So they sort of, especially back in the 80s and 90s when there was very, very few women, sort of people would do a double take and think, oh, she's in orange overalls, she's a marshal, But more often than not, people were fine.
But did you find it difficult? Were there challenges?
There's been challenges along because I became the butt of what I call banter. And I let it go on, I suppose, too long, really, in a way. But I didn't really know how to deal with it. So when people are making jokes, taking mickey of a Jamaican accent, which I don't have, and I can't even do a Jamaican accent, or they'd make jokes about, be careful, she might come and pinch your tires or pinch your CD player, make out that I lived in, Southeast London and was a gangster. Sometimes people would ask me, why is my hands white on one side? And then you go to the other extreme where people would just ignore you, or I'd get sidelined. I was never good. Sometimes I wasn't always good enough to do something. But I also had another hardcore group of friends who would always encourage me and tell me, no, carry on, keep doing what you're doing. You're very good at what you're doing. You're very precise at your paperwork. So that gave me hope.
And how did you keep yourself going? Because that must have developed your character in a way that you hadn't necessarily foreseen when you thought, God, James Hunt, fantastic, Derek Bell.
It's been hard. When I look back now, it's been hard because there were often moments when it's like, why am I doing this? This is meant to be a hobby. This is meant to be for enjoyment. But then equally, I've had some really good moments and I've had some really good times. So I suppose in a way it's been 50-50, but when it's been down, it's been down. And I've had lonely spots. I mean, I've sometimes maybe gone to a race meeting and nobody's really spoken to me much. But then other ones, then I'm part of the team properly, and But I always still feel that I'm a little bit of an outsider, and there's like an inner sanctum which I've never really managed to quite become part of.
And that's despite you sort of following your dream, as you might say, and becoming a clerk of the course, which is that's quite that's a big step up the ladder, isn't it? I mean, to do that is a hell of an achievement, surely.
Well, yes, it is. I mean, as I said, I started off as a marshal on the course. Then within about 5 years of that, I then became a secretary of the meeting, and I was a secretary of the meeting for over 15 years, which is also a very responsible position. Becoming a clerk of the course was a natural progression, and so I applied, but it took me again a long time, because although I applied and I got given my probation license, it was hard to find a club that would take me on to mentor me. So I think I lost about a year, but eventually I got involved with another club, and then I got my license.
Do you know why no one would take you on? Was there any reason given?
No reason. There's never a reason. I had to go back to then MSA to say that I was struggling, and then they found me a mentor, and then it went off from them. There's never any real reason. You can't really put your finger on it. It's just that people just have this way of being able to pretend you're not there. You might give up, you'll go away, but unfortunately I didn't.
So how do you think you could change this problem about racism? Because we had Nick Hamilton talking on the last podcast about racism that he and his family encountered in motorsport. How do you think you can go about, or what do you want to do to change this at the grassroots?
Well, there's two things. I think within the motorsport family, there needs to be a better understanding. There needs to be, I think, a bit like you do for companies sometimes, you have some diversity awareness, some diversity training, because there will hopefully be more of us come along, and and people of all colours, and they need to understand you can't sideline people. You need to know how to talk to people about making offensive comments, etc. And then for me, it's also now trying to bring in more youngsters in at the grassroots level. So I've just recently formed an academy, or I'm in the process of forming an academy, calling Next Racing Generation, and I've got access to about 13 to 14 youngsters between the ages of 14 to 19. And although some of them have been karting and doing bits and pieces, they hit brick walls. They don't always know the next level, how to get from karting maybe into racing, because nobody's going to help them properly to progress. Teams will take the parents' money and they'll run them for the weekend or whatever, but they're not very good at harnessing that child's ambitions to try and get them forward. I'm also wanting to talk to more, try and maybe go and talk into schools and talk to them about their next steps in education, let them be aware that there's all sorts of courses they can do. You can do engineering, you can become a designer, and what colleges and universities you need to attend. I'll encourage them to go to Autosport on a Thursday and Friday when all the education and all the universities are available to get all the information. And it's all of that, hopefully a all round holistic thing.
That's a lot on your plate. I mean, are you getting any help at all? I mean, have you spoken to any of the sort of Motorsport UK or any of you've mentioned the MSA, the BARC and so on? Have any of these organisations in the UK, the motoring organisations, who might be able to help you and sort of work in partnership with you?
Oh, hopefully. I mean, none of them have approached me yet, so I think it's going to have to be me now knocking on their doors to say, this is what I think, we should try and do. Can we work together and do it? So that's going to be my next step.
And what about Lewis Hamilton's lead on this? The Black Lives Matter movement, and also his foundation, which he set up, looking to extend diversity, not just into drivers, but also engineering and across the whole motorsport industry.
Well, I am now trying to tap into that. So that's another reason why I formed the academy. So I am on their radar at the moment, and I'll also look at some of the other initiatives that are around. So I also want to look at the F1. And I've also recently found out that the Mayor of London has got a sporting grant as well. So I'm going to also try and look at that.
You're not like a mission. You are now determined to make a change, to make a difference.
That is going to be hopefully my legacy. I've got to the stage now that I want to make a change. If I can't get any further within my motorsport, which I'm carrying on doing, but I want to make a difference to anybody coming up behind me, both as either a driver and both as an official, because I also want to try and get more people of colour involved as being a marshal, because it's a lovely way of giving you some more experience especially if you're maybe a student wanting to get more things on your CV, because when you're a marshal, you're given roles to do of importance, and there's detailed attention, and it's a really good way of being A, to watch some racing, and B, to do something that's responsible.
You've got to admire her passion and her determination to make contact with Lewis Hamilton and any bodies that are out there who she feels you can help. And it's because she's loved the sport and she's followed it for 30 years or more, right from the start with James Hunt and Derek Bell and so on. And I'm fascinated to stay in touch with her as much as you're going to stay in touch with Fred, to see how much progress, how much change can be brought about.
Yeah, I just loved it listening to her. She's obviously such a completely passionate fan of the sport. I mean, I think the fact that she likes James Hunt probably gives a slight clue to her age, shall I say. And then, of course, Derek Bell. So she has her big favourites, very famous names from the sport. But as you say, I think, David Richards and the people at Motorsport UK, they can do with people like Carol being at the centre of some of the initiatives that they're bringing into play, because here's someone at the coalface of the sport, and she's clearly been doing a great job.
And she was clearly watching all the races happening at Silverstone and so on. And let's just, before we finish, touch on two Germans, shall we? Let's go positive first. Nico Hülkenberg, who was called in at the last minute to race for Racing Point because of the COVID-19 infection for Sergio Perez, didn't make it to the start grid for the British Grand Prix, but was there for the 70th anniversary race and was, in with a shout, should we say, of a podium at one stage. He's still yet to score one in Formula One. But how much good has he done his case for a return to Formula One? A lot of people say he'd retired. Well, he hadn't at all. He was desperately stayed on in Formula One if he could. But in terms of a return in 2021, can you see that?
I can certainly see him being back in Formula One in some capacity in 2021, maybe even just as a reserve driver. But I think he certainly warrants a second look by everyone at someone who could be a race driver again. And I mean, I love Nico for lots of reasons. First of all, when I competed in A1 GP, he won the championship for Germany in A1 Grand Prix first season. That team was run by Willy Weber, and I remember Michael Schumacher, no less, coming to support Nico at that time. And then I loved him a lot more, actually, in 2010 when I was running Cosworth, because he brought Cosworth its last ever pole position in Formula One, Brazil, in 2010 when he was driving for Williams. So I was delighted to see him come back for what is effectively my old team, Jordan, now Racing Point. And that third place on the grid on Saturday was absolutely extraordinary. I mean, to put it into perspective, he was the fastest man on the circuit, bar the two Mercedes-Benz cars, which are a second a lap quicker than everyone else in qualifying. So he was absolutely nailing it. And I think he's done himself a power of good. So let's hope it's not the end of the line again for Nico Hülkenberg. One final thing, we talked, Jonathan, quite a lot about sort of the mental focus required in our sport. I am a great believer that sometimes when drivers have a little bit of time away from the sport, and actually particularly when they think it's all over, it reignites the flame in their belly. And when they get back in the cockpit, if they get that chance, often you can see a resurgence. And I suspect that Nico Hülkenberg has spent much of the last 8 months wondering what he's going to do with the rest of his life. And the answer was get back in the cockpit of a Racing Point and stick it on the second row of the grid.
Have you been reading my mind? That was exactly what I was going to say, because that actually leads into the other German, Sebastian Vettel. End of the line, question mark. I mean, that team radio criticism saying, you got the strategy wrong. He's not driving himself particularly well either, because that spin early on was not impressive. There seems to be a real breakdown of relations. And there are those who would say, in a sporting environment, when a star player and a team has fallen out, you need to find a way out of this quickly, because otherwise it does nobody any favours.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm thinking about the second half of the 1999 season when Damon Hill was driving for us at Jordan and he wanted to retire, and, things were going pear-shaped left, right and centre. And, it was just, I mean, really he should have stopped and we should have stopped as well with Damon, because you're right. When you're right in sport, when someone's mind has gone or when the team's focus on that person has drifted, you really need to move on. And it was really a shame to see Sebastian. I mean, interesting in that 70th anniversary Grand Prix, I mean, he made the mistake on the first lap. He got all crossed up, had a massive tank slapper, had a huge spin. And then after the race, said to the team, our strategy was rubbish. And then Mattia Binotto came back and said, well, no, actually, if you hadn't spun in the first lap, that would have been, would have been a lot better. So you've got, they're at loggerheads. My personal view on it, if I was Lawrence Stroll, and bearing in mind this guy has got many billions of dollars and has just acquired the Aston Martin company and is about to rebrand Racing Point as Aston Martin. If I was Lawrence Stroll, I would unhesitatingly put Sebastian Vettel in the second Aston Martin alongside Lance Stroll next year. To do that, I would take him away from Ferrari at the earliest possible opportunity. I would get him to go and have a big long holiday, to laugh, to play, to rest, to relax, and to come back into a team that puts both its arms around him. And then I would build that team around Sebastian Vettel through the 2021 and 22 season, because I am 100% sure that this guy is just having a tough moment, not helped by the team that he's been driving for. And if he can be rebuilt in terms of his confidence and his focus, I think we'd see a hugely motivated Sebastian Vettel come back. And he only has to do one thing. He only has to give Aston Martin its first victory in Formula One in what is effectively a very controversially got a lot of assistance from Mercedes-Benz in recent years. The reality is that I do believe that there's an opportunity for him and there's an opportunity for the team, and they should grasp it. And I'll mention again Damon Hill, because having mentioned about the kind of slightly negative experience we had with him in the second half of 1999, the reason we employed him in the first basis was as a former world champion, he was able to show us how to break through and become a race winner. And the great thing about Grand Prix winners is once they've learned how to do it, they can show a team how to do that. And I think that's what Sebastian Vettel could bring to Racing Point, to Aston Martin. And I think it's something that would really, really benefit them. So I hope Lawrence Stroll's listening. I hope Lawrence Stroll signs Sebastian Vettel. I would like to see this 4 times world champion retained in the sport.
And remember, Seb, all you've got to do is just achieve that first win for Aston Martin in Formula One. I will leave it hanging there. I've got a solution, by the way. If they were to do that for Ferrari, why not just put Nico Hülkenberg in Sebastian Vettel's seat for the rest of the season? Just a thought.
Not a bad idea.
If you've enjoyed the podcast, spread the word, rate, review, like, and above all, subscribe. Stay safe, and Mark and I will talk to you again in September.